los futuros investigadores en ecología de la paz en la fertilidad. Así que sin nada más que decir, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to start by thanking Miguel for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. And Virginia Morandini arranged the lecture, I think. So thank you to her, too. I'm going to talk about a pretty old study which began as long ago as 40 years. I mean, long before many of you were born. And it finished more than 10 years ago. So in a sense, it's a historical study. But at that time, when the study started, there was a big interest in population limitation in birds, in what determines bird numbers. And that was the main interest in much of this work. And of course, as a young person, you hope that the information you get is relevant just not to the species that you're working on, but much more widely to a wide range of birds and possibly other animals. But anyway, the work that I'll be talking about was collected over a period now of, I mentioned, 40 years, and a lot of it in the south of Scotland, but also in various other parts of Britain. You're all familiar, I imagine, with this bird, the sparrowhawk, but I'll just start by reminding you of a few details of its natural history. I hope. Wait a minute. Oh, that's it. Okay. It's a relatively small birds of prey compared to other species, and it nests in forest, and it hunts in both forests and open country, and it eats almost entirely other birds, especially small songbirds. Now, everywhere the bird has been studied, it's been found to be monogamous, at least for each breeding season, and the pairs nest solitarily, and each pair is usually a considerable distance from other pairs. And usually, the pairs nest in the same localities each year. They build a new nest each year near to old ones, so that you can easily recognize the nesting territories of this species by groups of nests of different ages. And it's the presence of these clusters of old nests that makes it possible to find sparrowhawk territories at any time of year, summer or winter. And that's very convenient if you're working on it, because you have lots of spare time in winter, but none at all in summer. Usually, the bird lays between 4 and 6 eggs in a clutch, so that you can have up to 6 young in a brood, and no more than 1 brood is reared in any one year. And in the areas where I worked, usually about half the nests produce young in any one year, and the other fail for one reason or another. But the proportions of successes varied a great deal from year to year. Now, not only is this species very common in Britain, it's also one of our smallest birds of prey, as I mentioned, and as I don't need to remind you, the female is the larger sex. But in the sparrowhawk, this dimorphism is extreme. The female in the breeding season weighs about twice as much as the male. And linked with this difference, as you would expect, the female takes some larger prey than the male, but she also hunts in more open country than the male. So there's a big difference in the feeding habits of the two sexes. And in addition, in the areas where I worked, it turned out that the females have a slightly higher annual rate of survival than the males. And eventually, that leads to a surplus of females among birds of breeding age. Now, the next one is a map of Britain, as you can see, and the top area called Eskdale, that's the area where most of the data I'll be talking about this afternoon came from, but I'll also be using data from the other area, in fact from another 12 areas that are not shown in this map but scattered around the country. Now, throughout Britain, the sparrowhawk is resident year-round. It doesn't migrate. It's present in summer and winter, and the bird nests either in large forests like this plantation of conifers, or it nests in small woods in open country. in these small strips of forest. And every year I searched all through the woods in this area to try and find every single breeding pair and record their breeding performance, their egg-laying dates, the clutch size, the brood size, and of course ringed with leg rings, all the young that are produced. And in addition, each year I trapped as many of the breeding adults as possible and put rings on them, so that after a few years most of the individuals in the population were ringed, so I was able to follow the same individuals year after year, in many cases through their whole lives. But females were a lot easier to catch than males, so I have a lot more information about females, as you'll see later. But one of the first questions we asked is, what densities will sparrowhawks nest in different landscapes? And this is a map of an area in the middle of Scotland, and on this map the green patches show forest or woodland, and the black spots mark the positions of sparrowhawk nesting territories. And what I want you to notice in this is the extremely regular spacing of the nest sites. In this area, the birds typically nested about 2 to 3 kilometers apart. And in every area in which we studied the bird, we found this regular nest spacing. This is another area, and again, the nests, as you can see, are evenly spaced, but the nests here are much closer than in the previous picture. Here they're about 1 kilometers apart. In fact, in all 14 areas from which we were able to get data, the nests were always uniformly spaced within woodland, but the distances between the nests varied greatly from one area to another. And to get a measure of nest spacing, I simply took each nest, any nest on that, and measured the distance from that nest to its nearest neighbour. So each nest had a nearest neighbour distance, and then as a measure of spacing in the area as a whole, I took the average nearest neighbour distance. And it emerged that in each area, that average nest spacing was related to the local food supply, to the densities of small birds, and nests were further apart in areas where small birds were scarce. Now, if you look first of all at the left hand of those graphs there, the average nearest neighbour distance for each of 14 different areas is shown on the vertical scale up the side, and the bottom line is an index of prey numbers. And each spot refers to a different area. And the abundance of small birds that form the food of sparrowhawks was measured by a method that we call point counts. What I did was to select randomly selected localities within the woodland of each area and go to each of these localities, stand in one place for a set time, 10 minutes in my case, and count all the birds I could see or hear, all the small birds. And I did that for 30 or more different randomly selected localities in each study area, and the average figure gave me a measure of the densities of prey in each of those areas. And the general trend, as you can see, is that as the prey density increases in different areas, so the average nearest neighbour distance declined. In other words, sparrowhawks nest closer together at higher densities in area where their prey are more plentiful. Now, the left-hand graph shows the numbers of prey, the numbers of songbirds, and the right-hand graph is the same data converted to prey biomass. And again, the relationship is clear. The birds are nesting at greater densities, closer together, where their food is more plentiful. But there is a point, about number 4 on this nearest left-hand graph, beyond which sparrowhawks seem not to nest any closer than about 0.5 kilometers. And I think there's probably some social interaction at that range which prevents them going closer, even though prey density may continue to rise. But that's speculation, I don't know that. But the general trend is that greater densities in areas where prey are more plentiful. So it seemed then that in well-forested areas, the density of sparrowhawks was related to their food supply. But there are many landscapes in Britain that look more or less like this. This is an agricultural landscape with farm crops grown in different fields, and the fields are separated by hedgerows, and the abundance of birds in these landscapes is very high. So there's a lot of food for sparrowhawks. But the problem for sparrowhawks in areas like this is there are no forest patches big enough for them to nest in. So in landscapes like this, the densities of sparrowhawks are held below the level that the food supply would permit simply by shortage of nest sites. And I show you this slide just to make a general point for birds of prey, that the bird of prey populations often seem to be limited by one of two factors, by the food supply or nest sites, and shortage of one or the other can limit the breeding density in different areas. Since this work was done, we now realize that predation is another factor that can limit bird of prey densities in some areas. In these areas, we had no goshawk, so no predator able to take sparrowhawks. Now, providing the environment is reasonably stable, it turned out that sparrowhawk numbers also remain fairly stable from year to year. And this slide shows the numbers of nests or breeding pairs found each year in Eskdale, the main study area, over a period of more than 20 years. And the years are given along the bottom, as you can see, and the number of nests is up the side. And you see that nest numbers did fluctuate a little bit from year to year. The average number of nests in this area was 34, but throughout the whole period, the numbers remained within 15% of that average level, and there was no long-term upward or downward trend. Now, compared to the fluctuations in numbers that you get in many bird species, this represents a quite remarkable degree of stability, yet that stability is typical for many birds of prey. But you can only find that level of stability in stable environments. If, for example, some of the woodland is cut down, or if small bird supplies get scarcer, if they decline, then of course the numbers of sparrowhawks would change. But over this period in this area, the environmental conditions remain fairly stable. So the question was, how does the breeding population remain so stable from year to year? What are the proximate mechanisms? And I mentioned earlier that I trapped all the females in the breeding population every year. So in each year, some of the birds are ringed and they're known from previous years because they nested in earlier years in the same area, but also new birds enter the population each year. And all this graph shows is the number of new breeders plotted each year in relation to the number of previous breeders left over from earlier years. And if you look at this, you find that in years when there are many previous breeders left from the previous year, then very few new breeders are added. But in years when very few old breeders are left, then many new breeders are added. So recruitment to the breeding population each year is density dependent. So this situation then, the average population, I should say, over the whole period of years was 34 pairs. So on this diagram, that line simply joins 34 on one axis to 34 on the other. It's not a regression line, but it shows the relationship you would expect if the number of new breeders added each year had exactly matched the number of new breeders lost from the previous year. And the actual points on that graph show the data that were actually obtained. And you can see that they all lie close to the line. So that reveals the mechanism by which the stability of numbers is maintained. This is because the total number of available territories in the area remains more or less constant from year to year. And generally speaking, a new bird can enter the breeding population only when an old one dies and leaves a vacancy. So the birds are competing for a limited number of territories, themselves determined by the local environment. And evidently in this area, there were always enough new birds or non-breeders available to fill the gaps. Okay, moving on to a different point. Over the years, I was able to record, of course, the breeding success for many different females, but for exactly 200 different females, I recorded their lifetime reproductive success. That is the total number of young produced by individuals during their entire lifespan. And my assumption was that all the nests of these females occurred within the study area. For the majority of females, I think this is a perfectly reasonable assumption, but there may have been a few females that may have attempted nesting one or more years outside the area and unknown to me. There's nothing I could do about that, but I think it's not enough to affect the conclusions. Well, when you think about lifetime reproductive estimates, the potential for bias in those estimates is very considerable, simply because it's easier to record the lifetime success of a long-lived individual than a short-lived one. This is simply because the longer a bird lives, the more difficult it is to keep track of it year after year. So the first question I had to ask is, how typical are my 200 females in terms of their lifespans? How typical are they of the population as a whole? Well, the first point to make is that sparrowhawks are not especially long-lived. The oldest bird, the ages are given along the bottom there, and the oldest bird ever encountered in our area lived to be 10 years of age. Now, the cross-hatched columns, the striped columns in that, show the expected age composition of the population based on knowledge of the mortality rates of different age groups and ages of first breeding. And the yellow columns show the age composition of those 200 females whose lifetime reproductive success I knew. Now, there's no statistically significant difference between those two distributions, so this means that I can assume, I am safe in assuming, that my sample of females is representative in terms of their lifespans of the female population as a whole. So the sample is not biased in that respect. And the next slide here shows the numbers of young raised by those individuals, 200 individuals, during their whole lives. And that number varied from 0 up to 24. Now, about 16% of all the females that attempted to breed, they laid eggs, produced no young at all during their lives. That's the left-hand column there. They therefore left no descendants. But the remaining females, as you can see, produced between 1 and 24 young during their lives. And that peak at 3 to 5 young is because 3 to 5 is the commonest brood size, and most females raised only one brood during their lives. But the main point to take home from this slide is that there is enormous variation in the lifetime productions of individual females. So the first question, of course, is what causes that variation, and one obvious factor I've already mentioned is the lifespan of the individual birds. And on this graph, the number of young, the number of fledglings produced by different individuals is shown at the side there, and the lifespan of individuals along the bottom, and each dot there refers to a different female. And you can see that the general trend is that females, is for the number of young raised to increase, as you'd expect, with the lifespan of the individual. But there's a lot of variation within age groups. You can see, for example, that some of the birds lived to be 7 or 8 years of age, but they still raised no more young than some of the 1-year birds. And that oldest lived individual lived to 10 years, that produced by no means the maximum number of young. So there's great variation between individuals, but the general trend is to increase with increasing age. Now, another factor that influences the number of young produced per lifespan, of course, is the age at which the bird begins to breed. And some females, like this one here, begin to breed in their first year of life. You can tell that's a first-year bird because its dorsal surface is coloured brown rather than blue, which is an older one. But other females we found, ring females, did not breed until they were 2, 3, or even 4 years of age. And that delay is apparently because of competition for territories, in which older birds win out over young ones. So for many individuals, it delays the date at which they can start to breed. Well, taking all this information together with information on survival up to breeding age, I was able to calculate the total numbers of young produced by an entire cohort of young sparrowhawks, an entire year class. And on this, the number of young is shown up the side there, and the lower scale is a percentage scale from 0 to 100% of individuals. And different individuals are arranged there in order of their lifetime production of young. And the main proportion is that the main point is that a large proportion, 72% of all the young that leave the nest die before they can reproduce themselves. So none of those birds produce any young. Also, there's a very small percentage, 6% of the total, that attempt to breed but produce no young, and only 22% breed successfully. And those produce enough young not only to replace themselves, but all the other non-productive young as well. Now, with a pattern like this, you can easily calculate that the 5% of most productive young, the ones at the extreme right-hand age, they produce 50% of the young in the next generation. Of course, that pattern is repeated in generation after generation. You obviously ask the question, why are some individuals much more productive than others? And I don't know the answer to that, but we were considering that 4 factors might influence the lifetime success of an individual. The first is the genetic makeup of the bird. Some may do better than others simply because, for some reason, they're genetically superior. The second possibility was that young birds might get something from their parents, not their genes, but something else that helps them in later life, maybe experience or knowledge or something like that. The third possibility, that some birds may do well simply because of what I've called accidents of birth. They happen to be born in a good year or in a good territory or something good for them. And other things is, it could be entirely due to chance. Some individuals may have superior genes, but they may have an accident and die early in life. So they were the 4 things that we thought might influence lifetime success. But at this point, I can't tell you any more than that because we weren't able to pursue the study long enough to get a clear answer. But that's what we would have looked at if we had the chance. But anyway, lifetime reproductive success is one kind of information you can obtain by following the same individuals throughout their lives. But another type of information, of course, is to see how the performance of birds changes during the course of their lives. Now, on this slide here, I've shown 4 different aspects of performance in relation to the age of the birds. And on each graph, the age of the birds is given along the bottom here, from 1, 2, 3 up to 8 or more years of age. And this is a different aspect of performance. And this first one here shows the survival to the next year of birds of different age. And you can see here that one-year-old breeders have less than a 50% chance of surviving to the next year. But their survival chip increases with age, and then till they're 3, 4, or 5 years of age, and then it drops off rapidly through life, so that when they become old, at 8 or more years of age, they have a less chance of surviving to the next year than even some of the 1-year birds. The next one here is the egg-laying date in May. Now, in a sparrowhawk, as in many birds, a good laying date is an early date, early in the season. The earlier a bird starts to breed, the better its chance of success. And sparrowhawks start breeding quite late in May, about the 12th or 13th of May, and then as they get older, on average they get earlier, and then later in life they get later again. The third one here shows the clutch size, When they start off young, they're laying relatively small clutches. They get better, and then smaller clutches again in later life. And this is the number of young raised per nest in different age groups. Again, that goes on increasing right up to quite late in life and then drops off very suddenly. Now, as you can see, the shape of those curves varies with the different aspects of performance that you measure. But all of them show the same pattern of an improvement in the early years of life, which we assume is due to increasing experience or social status, and then a deterioration in later life, which we put down to senescence. Now, senescence has proved, as you all know, extremely difficult to demonstrate in birds. The reason it's difficult to demonstrate is that you can normally only age birds when they're young. It's the only way you know how old they are. So you have to start, you need a long-term study to mark the birds when they're young and then follow them through their natural lifespans. But second problem is that so many birds in a wild population, especially like this, so many die each year that you have to start with a very large sample of young ones just to get enough in the older age groups to record that deterioration phase. But we now have data for more than 12 or 13 species of birds that has shown that senescence is just as much a factor of bird populations as it is in our own lives. Okay, I'll move on to a different aspect now. I want to look at how I've talked about the performance and survival of individual birds. I now want to look at the variation in habitat and try and show how that influences the birds. Specifically, I'll be talking about variation in quality of territories. Now, in any landscape like this, where you get patches of forest, you'd find, if you were in Britain, a number of sparrowhawk nesting territories. But we also find in an area like this that not all territories are occupied every year. There are always a small number of vacant ones in particular years. And over a number of years, I found that nesting places were not occupied at random. Over a period of years, birds showed marked preferences for certain territories which were occupied much more than you'd expect by chance at the population levels found, and other territories that were occupied much less than expected by chance. In other words, I could statistically demonstrate that the birds had favoured patches of nesting habitat. Now, the reason for these preferences was obvious when you looked at breeding success. Now, on this slide here, I've graded all the territories, 1, 2, 3, or 5, according to the number of years they were occupied in a 15-year period. So a grade 1 territory then was occupied in 1, 2, or 3 years in a 15-year period, not necessarily successive years. Grade 2 was occupied in 4, 5, or 6 years in a 15-year period, and so on, to a grade 5 territory, which was occupied in 13, 14, or 15 years in a 15-year period. So that's just a measure of occupancy, from seldom occupied to very frequently occupied. And the next one shows the number of nests recorded in territories of different grade, and these figures here are the percentage of nests that were successful in those different grades of territory. And if you look down this column, you'll see that nest success increases. So in other words, the most frequently occupied territories had the best chance of a successful nest. The birds were apparently very good at picking out the best bits of habitat. And that final column there is just a measure of the average number of young produced per attempt in these different territories, and there's more than twofold variation in production of young there. So there's a correlation between occupancy and nest success. Now, the layout of this slide is exactly the same as the previous one, but I wanted to know why nests failed in some territories more than others. Was there any major factor there? And in the sparrowhawk population, there were 3 major causes of breeding failure, which are listed along the top there. One I've called non-laying. in that many birds, many pairs of birds, built a nest, but they then laid no eggs. They just stayed around a while without laying. There's a second category where birds laid eggs, but they then deserted them immediately afterwards. And the third major cause of failure was predation. They laid eggs, and then either the eggs or the chicks were taken by a predator. And then there's, in the last column, there are a group of other kinds of minor causes of failure, which are just all grouped together. But the main point was that there was all these causes of failure were recorded in all these grades of territory. There was no predominant cause in any one category of territory. The poor territory, the good territories suffered the same kinds of failures as the poor ones, but just less of them. But all these different causes of failure, we thought, could have been manifestations of a single underlying problem, namely food shortage. Because many birds, if they can't get enough food, they can't produce eggs. Other birds might produce eggs, but then end up in such poor body condition that they then have to desert the nest to go and hunt. And similarly, yet other birds may have eggs or chicks, but they spend so much time hunting for food that they leave their nests or chicks exposed to predators. Now, the evidence that we have of this view is not strong, but it's based basically on experimental provision of food at nesting territories. Over the years, we had about 15 sparrowhawk territories in poor habitat that we gave supplementary food to, right from before they started laying. And all these artificially fed nests, they were all successful. None of them failed for any of these reasons. So it remained possible that all these causes are really symptoms of an underlying problem of food shortage. Well, where you have a situation where some territories are successful and produce young every year, and where other territories frequently fail, you obviously ask the question, is this high productivity of some territories, is it due to the quality of the territories themselves, or is it due to the quality of the birds that occupy those territories? Is it the environment, the habitat, or is it the bird? Well, in the case of the sparrowhawk, we knew that it couldn't be entirely due to individual birds because the turnover of birds on territories was quite high, and most of the good territories were occupied for quite short periods. But because the birds were ringed, I knew exactly how long each female spent on a particular territory before either dying or moving to another territory. And this slides here show the percentage of females that were present on territories for 1, 2, 3, or 6 or more years of their lives, females and males. And you can see the majority of sparrowhawks were present on individual territories for only 1 year, but some stayed for longer, up to 6 or even 8 years on the same territory. So there was a very high turnover of individuals on territories. And although in this area some territories were occupied without break for 15 or 20 years, this was obviously caused by a succession of different individuals occupying the same territory in succession, but each individual staying a relatively short time. Now, part of the turnover of birds on territories was, of course, caused by mortality. About a third of females died each year on average, and that created gaps for new birds to move in. But in addition to this, it turned out that many birds were changing territory from 1 year to the next. And these slides simply shows some figures for females that were caught in 2 successive years. And we're looking to see here whether the same female was on the same territory it was on the year before, or whether it moved to a different territory. And about 2/3 of all the females that we re-caught were on the same territory, but a third of them had changed territory, and similar figures for the males. So there's big turnover, big movements among birds, and that, of course, raised the question, why do birds change territory in this way? Well, one relationship that emerged was with previous nest success, in that we found that birds were much more likely to change their territory if they failed in their breeding than if they succeeded. Another relationship that emerged was with age, in that birds became less likely to change territory with increasing age. And these relationships are shown on this slide here. The age groups, as you can see, are shown along the bottom here. This is what birds did between year 1 and year 2 and year 3 of life. And this is the percentage that changed territories. And the top line are birds that fail in their breeding, and the bottom one is birds that succeed. Now, there's 3 points to take from this slide. One is that the birds that fail in their breeding are much more likely to change territory than those that succeed. The second thing is that in both groups, the tendency to change territory declines during the course of the life. And the third point is that at this sort of age, old age, the lines converge. So when you get to very old birds, they tend to stay on the same territory, whether they succeed or not the year before. And of course, both of those trends are statistically highly significant. It's possible, of course, that with the old birds, having bred on a territory for several years, they're much less likely to be influenced by a single failure. I should also add that when sparrowhawks change their territory, they don't move as a pair. They move as individuals. So you can have situations where the male moves and the female stays, or the other way around. But anyway, after a breeding failure, the male and female responsible end up on different territories with different mates, generally speaking. But it turned out that with these relationships, the quality of the territory had a big influence on the tendency of birds to change territory. Now, on this slide here, these are my categories of territories from 1 to 5, poor to good, and these are the number of females that moved away from different grade territories in different years. And these are the grades of territories that those same females moved to. So although birds moved away from all territories, all grades of territories, they moved to mostly territories of higher grade. And the same was, the samples for males were smaller, but the same trend is there. So it seems then that territories in this area varied in quality. Birds competed over the good territories, and during their lives, many individuals moved from poor to good territories. And the poor territories tended to be occupied irregularly, mainly by young birds, which, if they survived, could later move to a better territory. So these then are some of the strategies pursued by sparrowhawks to increase their own survival and reproductive success. And I've tried in this talk to emphasize the variation between individuals in survival and productivity, and also the variation in habitat from poor to good. But individual and habitat quality interacted to influence the performance of individuals and also to regulate breeding density. Now, I just want to go on to just say a few words about a completely different point, and that's the sex ratio of sparrowhawks and their subsequent survival. I mentioned earlier that females are much larger than males. And this slide here shows some data collected by one of my students showing the growth rate of young male and female sparrowhawks. And this graph is based on more than 100 individuals of each sex that were weighed. And you can see that, of course, although the two sexes hatch from eggs of the same weight, they very quickly begin to diverge. And by the time they get to be 8 or 10 days of age along the bottom there, you can tell just by looking at them whether they're males or females. Females are much bigger and they have much bigger legs and feet. So by the time you come to ring the birds at about 20 days of age, there's no difficulty in sexing the birds. But this differential growth raised a question for us. We knew that young birds compete for food. We knew that food is often scarce, as I mentioned. So the question for the student was really how smaller males manage to survive in the presence of sisters which are so much bigger than they are. Well, we discovered that males develop in their behavior much more rapidly than females. The young males learnt to stand up before the females. They could feed themselves several days earlier. They left the nest 3 or 4 days before the females. They could fly before the females. So really the way in which young males survived in the presence of bigger sisters was just to keep one step ahead of them throughout. Some of my colleagues, of course, pointed out human parallels in this as well, but I won't. Anyway, despite this difference, the sex ratio near fledgling in the population was just about 50-50. There's no strong bias towards females, as we thought there might have been. But I also looked at the sex ratio in broods of different sizes. In this species, as I mentioned, you can have brood sizes from 1 to 6 young at the bottom there. And along the bottom of each graph is shown the possible composition of sexes in each side of broods. So in a brood of 5 young, you could, of course, have all 5 males, or 4 males and 1 female, 3 males and 2 females, and so on through to 3 females. And the cross-hatched columns here show the expected sex ratio or frequency of families if the chances of any one young being male or female were equal. So that's what you might expect on an absolutely equal sex ratio, and the yellow columns show the frequency with which we recorded those. And there's no statistically significant difference between the observed and expected frequency of those different families. So whatever the size of the family, the sex ratio is effectively equal, at least at the time they leave the nest. Well, one other question we were able to look at was subsequent dispersal of the young. We wanted to know how far our young birds moved from the nest, from the natal site, to their subsequent breeding area. And for this, we used entirely ring recoveries supplied by members of the public, because members of the public live over the whole country and they can report sparrowhawks. So we excluded our own data of birds retrapped within the study area, because of course that's biased towards short movements. But if you can imagine in the circular patterns there that the natal site is in the middle there. That's the bullseye in the dartboard. So that's where the bird was born, and each dot shows the location of a bird reported by a member of the public, usually found dead in the breeding season. And you can see that most of them were reported within about 20 kilometers of where they were raised in a subsequent breeding season, but some had moved much further. We had one bird that had moved further than 100 kilometers. And the left-hand slide there simply shows the number of recoveries in concentric circles out from the birthplace. So that, again, is another measure of the distance these birds move between their natal site and where they're likely to subsequently breed. Of course, we don't know for sure that these birds were breeding, because all we know is the bird was found dead in the breeding season. But very likely they're in potential breeding habitat. Well, the last point I just want to show you some data on is how the mortality varies from the year, through the year. But these data are not based on radio-tagged birds or anything useful like this. These are based on carcasses of sparrowhawks that were found by, or dead sparrowhawks found by members of the public and sent in to us for analysis of pesticide residues. But they'd accumulated over a period of 40 years, so I thought it would be interesting to look how the number of carcasses varies during the course of the year. And the orange colour there represents fully adult birds, and the yellow is the birds in their first year of life. And these data, of course, because they're found by members of the public, they're not necessarily representative of all mortality. Most of the birds had died by accidents or had starved to death. But these data indicate 2 main peaks of mortality. One is in August, September. These are when the young first become independent. A lot of mortality then, which is probably due to inexperience. And then a second peak is at the end of winter. And that affects both age groups, young and old. And most of those birds reported in the spring were birds that had starved to death. But this is in Britain, where many of our birds move out for the winter. It's not like southwest Spain, where you have a lot of birds moving in for the winter. With us, they leave. So the end of winter is the time when bird populations are at their lowest level of the year, and where sparrowhawks evidently suffer quite substantial mortality from starvation, judging by the body condition of the birds. But anyway, what that does show is that mortality occurs throughout the year in sparrowhawks, but with different frequencies at different times of year. Well, that brings me to the end of what I want to say. If I can just summarize the main points that I've tried to make to you today. The first point was that the numbers of sparrowhawks that breed in any one landscape depend primarily on the amount of forest, but within the forest, breeding densities correlate with available prey supply, with the birds spacing themselves more widely in areas where prey are scarce. The second point was that although in particular areas, providing the environment remains stable, then breeding densities remain stable from year to year. The third point concerned lifetime reproductive rate, showing that only a small proportion of individuals in any one year class contribute most of the young in the next generation. Another point was that during the natural lifespan of the birds, survival and reproduction improved up to midlife and then deteriorated again, presumably because of senescence. The fifth point was that in any area, the quality of nesting territories varied because the habitat itself varied, and good territories were occupied much more often and produced more young per nesting attempt than poorer territories. The very best territories were apparently strongly competed, but most birds were present on good territories for only a year or two. And during their lives, many individuals moved up the housing market from poor to good territories. And most sparrowhawks settled presumably with intent to breed within about 20 kilometers of where they were raised. The last point was during the course of the year, mortality occurred in every month, but apparently with two main peaks, one in late summer involving mainly young birds, and the other at the end of winter involving both age groups. So there were the main points I tried to make today. So thank you very much indeed for listening.